It is, isn't it? It wasn't like this. It was actually really broken up. There were, in that little teeny front space up there, before they remodeled, there were 3 offices in there. And this was like one long, dark hallway down the back side, and the kitchen was back here in the corner. It was a mess. It had been, this whole building was the first supermarket on this Heights area in like the 60s. Before there was anything east of here. It's crazy. And then it became a pharmacy on one half and office space on the other. And the church bought the office space eventually. And then the pharmacy went out and it became more office space over here. And then that business sold or went under, and the church said, well, let's buy the second half, and eventually wanted to move the youth group into here, which is what it did over time. But it was never really remodeled. So it was the weirdest, most unwelcoming hodgepodge. There was like a giant metal pole at one point, just right in the middle. It was like a support thing. It was just a mess. So when they remodeled, it's actually, I think it's become like the nicest meeting space actually in the church in a lot of ways. So it's been really nice.
Good transformation.
Yeah, we try not to have them beat it up too much. Students, but good luck.
We're admiring all the musical equipment too. It's fun to see that variety of drums and.
Yeah, we never used those ended up in here by default. Jeff offloaded those on us, the worship director. We don't really use what are the congas? Yeah. We use the djembes pretty well.
Cool.
But yeah, we sort of go in cycles where we'll have a couple students that are pretty musically gifted, and then we won't. And so, but we never have like a full worship band. It's usually just guitar and one kid on the drum, or something like that. We had a banjo player a couple years ago, and that was awesome. That was really fun.
High school student?
Yeah, high school student, Nicholas Bird. Yeah. He was trying to learn mandolin too, but it was never quite good enough. I can't figure out how people play the mandolin. I think it's like the most impossible instrument ever.
I'm just the other way. I think banjo is so much harder, I think.
I'm trying to figure out how to do this, so hopefully that'll work. Yeah, I just can't figure out how people get their fingers in that type of space without double strings on the mandolin. Well, does anyone know what time it is? My phone's not on me. We'll wait another minute or so. Where's everybody's churches? Where is everybody?
First Presbyterian, Salem.
First Presbyterian. Multnomah.
Monmouth.
Oh, Monmouth, okay. Awesome.
Where is that?
Yeah.
Monmouth is a little south of Dallas, a little
About 15
west
minutes.
of Salem.
Okay. Not in my head like I knew, but then I realized I have no idea where Monmouth is.
On north of Corvallis.
What's the word?
Yes.
All I knew was I'd seen a sign on our last youth retreat down in that area. That's all I can remember. I know exactly. Oh God, let's see. Get started.
Yes. And if you have students in Western Oregon, you should let us know. We can connect with you.
That's very good.
Well, great. So I'm Matt Overton. I'm one of the pastors here. I'm an associate pastor for youth and families here at Columbia. And I was asked to present on the Columbia Future Forward, which is it's an extension of the ministry of Columbia, but it's its own separate nonprofit and engages in ministry to youth and young adults. And so I'm going to kind of walk you through the story of that and explain a little bit about how we got started, and happy at the end to take questions and maybe tell you a little bit about the why, like why I thought this might be a good idea to do youth ministry this way. I'm still not always convinced. It's still there's like I know all the holes in the model, so but it does seem to be doing a lot of what I hoped it would. So it's been really exciting. So I'm excited to share it with you. So I'm gonna jump in. This is sort of a combination of a couple of presentation decks. So the Forge. If you're getting a little bit of a presentation deck that I give in public schools, as well as with our adults that come in to help support the program. But the Columbia Future Forge basically is a program that teaches, prepares teenagers and young adults for full adult life and meaningful work. Now for me, the way that I define that full adult life is like the John 10:10 life. What does it look like for a human being to be fully alive and living abundantly? And we do that with a significant emphasis on job readiness, both because teenagers are very concerned about that, particularly Gen Z, which is 21 and over right now, are very practically concerned about what's coming next. More so than the millennials were. I know some of you are probably shocked that we're actually moving past the millennials at this point, but we have. And so there is a job emphasis, and also because I'm 38, I started working with teenagers when I was 20 years old, 19 actually, and over that time, I've noticed that less and less teenagers seem to have jobs. And for me growing up, jobs were a huge part of how I learned about what I was good at and what I wasn't good at. What kind of, I got to observe adults that were different than my parents, and some of those were really good role models, some of those were warning signs, right? That I was like, well, I'm not sure that's who I want to be in 10 years. And I also learned a lot about why my faith mattered, and why at times it really brought something in the public life that mattered, but also why it was like a wonderful alternative to some of the options that were out there for me as a teenager and young adult. All of that I learned as I did jobs. And so I watched as like my summer interns would come for youth group stuff, and I just was struck many times at some of the basic things that they weren't prepared to do, and that bothered me, but I didn't know how to connect it to youth ministry until we started in this life-ready, job-ready sort of program. Our kind of mission statement is that we are a mentoring and training program. Everything we do comes through mentoring. That's adult mentoring of teenagers and young adults, and then trainings that we do that are very practically sort of life-oriented. And our goal is to teach professional job skills and life skills to young adults from diverse backgrounds. Our program is mentoring-based, it's educational. It teaches integrity, accountability, money management, and helps young adults identify their unique talents and abilities. You'll hear the specific trainings that we do in just a little bit. But we try to encourage long-range thinking and goal setting. That's one of our main trainings that lasts the whole year. We encourage them to set goals for the next year of their life. But we also reflect on those from a gospel perspective. One of my favorite things I like to say, like, where does faith intersect this program, is that like when we teach on goal setting, a good example is that I always tell the parable of the Good Samaritan. So we both want to affirm their desire to set goals and be able to kind of prioritize what they want to do next, but I also want to say, you know, if you're unwilling to set aside goals in your life for the sake of your neighbor, are you really a fully alive human being? If you're unwilling to deviate from the course that you're on, then what is your life really about? And so we try to use the life skills as a way to help understand why the gospel matters. Not every student is interested in that. We're fine with that. But our Christian principles and our faith are leaked through in every single training that we do in one way or the other. From goal setting, we treat money management, which is one of our trainings, as kind of an opportunity to talk about stewardship. How do I actually want to use my money to impact the world for good instead of just spending my money or accruing my money? So anyway, we encourage long-range thinking and goal setting. We develop problem-solving skills and a willingness to risk failure. Those are two things that emerged later. When we actually got students out on job sites and things like that, we found out that the two biggest holes that they seemed to have were that they were often very afraid to make mistakes, because a lot of the areas that they work in school and other things teach them that a single bad grade, a single mistake is unrecoverable. And so they're terrified about getting things wrong, so they oftentimes want to gauge a situation to figure out how to get it just right, rather than just trying something and screwing it up and then learning. And then problem solving, because my experience, especially actually, the higher the socioeconomic level, my experience with a lot of teenagers is the more they've been involved in programs, and those programs tell them what to do next. And so a lot of times when they enter the workforce or just their day-to-day lives, they often struggle. So if you tell them to get from A to D without providing B and C, they feel at a complete loss as to how to do that, because they're so used to somebody providing the next step of what they need to do. And so these two values of teaching them problem-solving skills and a willingness to risk failure, and that's always combined with grace for me. People that understand a gracious God, understand that they are loved at the core of who they are, have a capacity to risk failure, because they know that that failure will not ultimately define their value and who they are. And I think a lot of students don't understand that because they aren't necessarily connected with that story that tells you that you have value apart from what you do, apart from what you achieve. We expect a high level of commitment, professionalism, and accountability. So we tell all our students that, and our adults that are our mentors in our program. serious enough that students feel the need to self-select out if they don't want to make a commitment or aren't ready to think about the next stage of life and plan for it. And we do that on purpose. Because we found if we don't do that, it really, the program ends up all over the place. Now, we'll get kids rides, we'll follow up with them on phone, but if they don't show any responsiveness to those efforts to engage, then we kind of say, well, we can't pour these adult volunteer hours into this student if that's kind of where they are. And we provide direct feedback and encouragement through high-quality mentoring. So we really try to build into the process learning experiences, like our mentors. If a kid goes and gets a job, we had a student get a job at a landscaping company around here called Pacific, and he's a wonderful kid. And he was there to clean equipment and wash cars, and one Saturday it was just bucketing rain. And out of sheer politeness, he made the decision that he didn't need to go down there and do all the equipment work because he thought it would be a waste of water and a waste of his time and their money, but he never called to check it through. And so come Monday morning, the guy comes into work at this, it's a very big landscaping company, and calls up Bryant's mentor and says, I'm going to fire this kid if we don't get this figured out. So Bryant's mentor says, okay, hold on, let me go figure out what happened. And so they had this three-way communication which helped Bryant get feedback on what he needed to understand about how the adult world works and what workplace expectations are. But it was also an opportunity for Bryant to learn how to walk through the door with somebody and apologize. I mean, we talk about the disciplines of confession in the faith, like this is what it looks like to actually cultivate that practice in somebody's life, and to say we own our mistakes as followers of Christ. This is what, and Bryant is a person of faith, and so it was a really cool opportunity. And the guy was like, I'm happy to keep you on, just know you've got to call and check through with me. So we cover a lot of stuff. We talk about accountability, about checking through and calling folks back, and just being responsive and things like that. We try to develop in there.
Matt, before you move it,
Yeah.
maybe we take a picture.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. And you can stop me at any point and ask questions.
Sweet. Thank you.
You get it, Bill? Yeah. Okay. And we say we're a jobs program, but we're primarily, I would say not also, but we're primarily a people and relationships program. The jobs and the life skills are simply, I think, a delivery mechanism to gospel work, which is human transformation, and that happens in small numbers of people, relationship to relationship. We tell our students we're not a college prep program. You maybe wouldn't be surprised, but I'm sometimes surprised at how many students hear the whole presentation and they still come up and ask whether we're going to force them to go to college. It's remarkable in some of the schools because that's what they're used to. They're used to this single-minded track of that's what you're supposed to do with your life. And we say to them that we're not so much interested in where our students get to, but who they're going to be when they get there. And I think too many of our school programs and public programs are interested in the kind of the where they're going to be and the what they're going to do, and not enough in helping them discern, like, who am I? Who has God made me? What brings me joy in this life? Like, what am I really after ultimately? And so a lot of students, whether they're high up in the socioeconomic spectrum or they're lower down on that ladder, I think they often arrive at these decisions and they have no idea why they've made them or why they're supposed to do that thing that's next. And I think it's a pretty terrifying experience. And so we're trying to spare them some of that by giving them a process and a relationship through which they're really discerning vocation. Like, what am I called to do and who am I called to be? So one of the quotes that guides us is, this is actually, funnily enough, often misattributed to Mark Twain, which is ridiculous, because Mark Twain, if you've ever read his stuff, would never write this ever. But it's actually the Reverend, I went and researched it. I was a history major in college, so I went and researched it. It's the Reverend Ernest Campbell, who came out of the Riverside Church in New York City, as it turned out. And he said the two most important days in your life are the day you're born and the day you find out why. And that's part of what we're trying to help them figure out is what's my why? Why am I here? What is life actually about? Open them up to those questions and those conversations. Another one is from my friend Mark Yaconelli, who lives down in Ashland, and Mark runs a storytelling initiative down there. And Mark, one of the things, and I think this is a quote actually from a sociologist out of San Diego State, but that the three great lies of our culture are you are what you do, you are how well you do it, and you are how much you do it. And I think all of us, and especially teenagers, and especially those outside the faith in many ways, really believe these three lies. Because if there is nothing beyond what we can see, touch, and feel, then I'm not really sure how you measure your value, other than what you achieve. And I think a lot of the anxiety and depression that our students are currently experiencing in our world, and those rates continue to go up, are because this is the only narrative that they have. mentality. And it's part of what we're trying to challenge in the program, to getting them to think about, why am I here and who am I really called to be? A story I like to tell, this from a guy in the UK that I got to meet this last summer, but it's about a woman named Naomi, and this is a real story. Naomi, the story is that Naomi woke up in her room, 16 years old, or 17 years old, in the UK, and she woke up to the sound of her parents downstairs making breakfast and kind of getting ready for the day. She woke up, she was ready to go to school and take her exams, her university exams in the UK, so she could decide whether she wanted to get a university education. Got ready, got dressed, walked down the hall to go to the bathroom to take a shower, walked into the bathroom and looked in the mirror, and there was like a 35-year-old woman staring back at her. She panicked, screamed, ran out of the bathroom, and ran smack dab into an 11-year-old child who hugged her and said, "Mom, what's going on? What's the matter?" She freaked out again and ran back into the bathroom, and the same woman was staring her back in the face. And she suffered from an episode of what's called severe global amnesia, which is in periods of high stress, certain people can actually revert mentally to be convinced that they're 15, 20 years younger than they are. And for her, she had this unsettling experience where she went to bed, or woke up initially thinking she was this 17-year-old with the world at her fingertips, ready to make all the choices about life, take her university exams, do what she wanted to do, all of her dreams. And moments later, she discovers she was a 35-year-old woman living in town council housing in the UK with 3 kids, no job, and literally, for her, viscerally, couldn't figure out how she got there for the next 2 to 3 days before she was able to kind of snap out of this episode. And part of why we built this is because I think there's a lot of adults and young adults that end up in a similar spot, something that feels something akin to that moment of, I don't know how I got here. This is not what I thought was going to happen in life. And part of what we're trying to do is try to disrupt that a little bit. So let me tell you a little bit about the history of the Forge. This was our first class of students where we actually assigned mentors right here at the Youth Center. But I'm going to share a little bit about kind of how it came to be. Let me see, I'm going to go back, and then we'll cover kind of nuts and bolts of what it looks like. I'm going to go to another presentation deck. That'll be more helpful. That's my daughter, Clara. Hold on, there we go. So this whole thing began with the economic downturn. When I was living in Northern California, we were in one of the worst hit areas for the housing downturn. Our house lost 60% of its value in 6 months, which was awesome. And we were underwater on our home. That was particularly hard for me because we had lost our house when I was 16, and that was through actually some financial mismanagement on the part of my parents. But my wife and I had done nothing wrong. It felt like we had put 20% down. We hadn't borrowed anything extra from our home. Like, we'd done all these right things, and it didn't matter. And so that was a really hard experience. That, combined with our head of staff retiring, caused us to begin to think, my wife wanted to, we had our first child, and she wanted to not work, and I was like, well, we need to move. We need to get out from under this house. And so we moved up here to Columbia, a church that was trying to figure out how to do typical youth ministry more intergenerationally. And I had a long-term kind of growing frustration with youth ministry in general. That I had a nagging sense that the way that we were doing youth ministry just didn't work any longer. And that we were pouring lots of resources into a model that was only semi-functional. And so that frustration was kind of there. I felt a sense of obligation because I was at a church that felt like was resourced well enough that if there was ever a place in my career that I could risk and try something different, this would be it. And I also felt like it was probably the last stop on the youth ministry rodeo, in which I started at 19. And I was like, well, so if this is the last stop, then let's figure out what we can really do if we were swinging for the fences. And about 2 years in, with all this stuff kind of stewing around within me, we bought a quote-unquote new home, which was actually like Bill knows my house, so 1937 built absolute junker with leaking roof, rotting ceiling beams, wiring that only Satan could have conceived of. And I gutted the whole thing with the help of a few friends and some contractors and started to put it back together. And as I did that, I had also noticed one of my frustrations with youth ministry was that largely youth ministry is like an upper middle class proposition. And so what I would find is that my low-income kids would often come and they'd be around us for 2 years or so, and then we would lose them because what I think I started to discover is that ultimately we would take a lot of their dignity away. I don't know how else to put that. Because by offering them free upper middle class trips or scholarship trips, free lunches and cups of coffee and things like that, I think slowly you rob a person of their dignity, and I think while they can't name that, they experience it at a visceral level internally, and eventually they get embarrassed by that and they want to walk away. And so I started trying to figure out, as I was remodeling the home, well, what if I could hire some of the kids that are more fringe so they could make money, we have relational time, and they feel like their dignity is intact. And so that's what I started to do, was hire them to remodel my home. I'll spare you the video. So my wife doesn't even like to watch this video because it's just the gutted inside my house. But you can watch it later if you really want. Necessity is the mother of all invention, which is a quote attributed to Plato. Our backs were against the wall kind of financially in some ways, and so we figured out this creative solution to get a home. All this kind of birthed out of this. So why don't I go back and tell you what emerged? I'll do that. The nuts and bolts of our program really started to gather out over the course of a few years. That we would recruit students and we would offer them 6 trainings in life skills and job skills. Those trainings include professionalism, how do I get a job, hold down a job, work properly in a work environment. We do personal goal setting, which lasts the entire school year. We set goals for a year. We also work through a discipline of thankfulness. So what does it look like to give thanks over things I even partially accomplished in the year before? And then how do I also learn then to not simply take credit for those myself, but how do I learn to recognize the people in my life that helped contribute to me arriving at the skills that allowed me to accomplish that goal? I think all those are gospel disciplines. So they do goal setting, they do money management, and then we bring in marriage and family therapists, and they do a personality profile and assessment, not to help them figure out what their career track's going to be, but to figure out how has God wired them, what brings them joy, what makes them want to get up and go to a certain class or engage in a certain activity in their life, so they kind of know what they really just enjoy doing, what's the delight of their heart when it comes to work, because I think all of us are ultimately designed one way or the other to work at something. So then they have follow-up on those trainings. We give each of our, we call them blacksmiths because it's a forge image, so blacksmiths and apprentices. So they follow up with their blacksmith with learning modules that build on the goal setting, or they build on the professionalism. And we've actually built in a second tier of trainings now for students that have been through the program for a couple of years. So some of our kids, not this Sunday, but the following Sunday, will be taking their professionalism training. Another group will be going to another room to learn conflict resolution in the workplace, but that's really my dodgy way of sneaking in nonviolent communication, which is also an essential trait of gospel work, is how do I learn to resolve conflict in ways that are loving? And so we teach them those kind of skills. And I think I said money management. And then we have a dinner at the last training of the year where they get a certificate. It's like a job training program certificate. But we really do that as kind of a sharing meal. It's almost like a kind of communion, really. They share about what they've learned about their mentor. They share about how they've grown through the program. They share about goals that they've accomplished over the course of the year. And we celebrate all of that in kind of this meal together that we sort of call internally the Last Supper. And it's often not, because they often stay with us multiple years and will continue meeting with their mentor over the course of the summer. Yes?
So, from the time they start till the time they get their certificate, what kind of time?
It's October to April, basically.
Is that 1 year increments, or?
Yeah, and then they just have just 1 year increment, and they just have to decide if they want to re-up. And some of them will go get jobs, right at the beginning. Some of them won't at all, and we're okay with that. Some of them will tag on with some of our affiliate programs, which you'll hear about in just a second. That's really up to them. We always tell them, we are into whatever you're into. You want to talk about working on cars? We'll try to pair you with somebody that knows how to do that, or at least we'll look for avenues for you to be able to explore that. You want to go into the military? We'll help you figure that out. When you want to go to college? We'll help you work through that as well. That's the beauty of the church, actually, itself, is it's this amazing network of people with skills, talents, and their own webs of connection out in the community. And when you begin to do this kind of work, I think you discover that there are all sorts of assets within the life of the church that you did not realize were there. And that people are longing to share those, but they don't have an avenue to do it through. And I found all sorts of people that have come out of the woodwork to say, oh, I know how to do this. If your kids need this, please come and find me, and I'd be happy to do that. There's a certification process at the end of the year, etc. Students have the option of pursuing employment along the way. They can continue to meet with their mentor over the course of the summer. They don't need to get a job. though we encourage them to. They don't have to be interested in college. And our only promise is we do not promise them we will get them a job or place them in a job. We tell them that is theirs to earn. We are there to help them, to give them with the best set of assets and trainings we can for them to go get a job. And we promise them we will get them through the door for at least 2 interviews. That's the promise that we can make with them. But we're not, there's probably places where we could like plug them into a job, but we're reluctant to do that. We want them in the framework of figuring out what they want to accomplish. I think I kind of covered that. So the first place that we started, when I hired kids to help work on my house, I quickly discovered that that was like illegal because of teen labor law. Like you can't really do that. You actually can in some capacities, but not in the way that I was doing it. And so I went off and read like teen labor law for like a month and a half, which is exhilarating, and figured out that you could do landscaping. And that was something that I thought teenagers could handle pretty well, and that I knew enough about that I could kind of start. So initially I started Motown Teen Lawn Care as a for-profit landscape company. And I did that because at the time it was way faster to start a for-profit than it was a non-profit. It also meant that I would very clearly be taking on all the risk and the church wouldn't, which I thought would be a better way to get the idea off the ground faster. And the church was in the middle of the first stages of the capital campaign. And so I knew that trying to go to bat for funding would not be workable. And I also like the way, I am not a like uber capitalist, but I do think that marketplace exchange can do some really good things. And so I had a sense that if kids knew that they were on an actual job for an actual company that sank or would swim on how well they did, that they would probably be incentivized to work harder. And so we would talk about that. We'd come out and I'd say, guys, I got $25,000 of my own money invested in this company, and we have to work faster today to get this done because right now you're dragging. And if we don't, this goes under, my investment goes under, and the job opportunity for the next 6 students that I think you don't know, but I imagine you care about a little bit, that job opportunity goes under for them too. And they understand that. Like, they get that. And I think they like that environment, as long as it's one that's not discouraging, and ours isn't. We try to coach kids from their mistake. We make a lot of leeway for them in terms of space. And we do always try to employ at least 1 or 2 kids that are very inefficient landscapers. We make it intentional. I think that's part of the gospel is it's fine. You want your 11 disciples who sort of understand the message, you need at least one who's going to betray and try to kill you. So that's kind of how I approach ministry in general. Like every team should have a function mix like that. I think our enterprises do, and we can do that. So it started with Motown, but as the interest grew, other things happened. This is actually the last one. I'll go back to this one. As I was hiring a crew boss for Motown, we had a student, a former student, who found the ad on Craigslist. They were a student at a boys' ranch we had served at over in Yakima years ago. And he happened to find the Craigslist ad. I was like, oh, I think I know who that guy is. I know that church. And came, and he wanted to be crew boss for the landscaping company. And he is, and he lives in that house right there, which is our college young adult house. That's a whole other crazy idea project that we have. But Daniel came through the door for the first interview. He's like, this is the coolest thing I've ever heard of, this whole jobs program. And he said, I'm a certified drone pilot, and I work with this guy who works for In Situ out in the Gorge that makes drones, and I think you should sit down and have coffee with him. So I did, and that guy was kind of all over the place. But I was like, we have some retired engineers at our church who would completely nerd out on drones. They're really good with kids, and they're really good with technical stuff. I bet we could build our own drone program. And so we did. Last year we started a drone program and had 9 initial students with the objective of getting them commercially certified as drone pilots. So they could go out and get an employable job with that, and it's all built around relationships. They fly drones together in our gym. They created this little obstacle course with some of the students there flying. This student and another student that's not pictured here, oh, he's in the next slide. These 2 students are actually, there's their drone licenses. They passed the test. They're certified drone pilots, and they're actually using this for their senior project at their local high school. In fact, just on the district website the other day, they had a photo that these 2 guys took of the new high school that they were just building out there, and I was so excited to see that on the website. And we talk about like the networks of people's skills in our churches. There's also this whole missional network that's come around this. Like Blake's mom was my daughter's 2nd grade teacher, right? I am continually tripping over this web of relationships that forms when you step outside the church with something the community around you actually values.
Amen.
And it's been really remarkable to see how much overlap there is in ways that I really thought of myself as a pastor that kind of operated outside the church. I had no idea until I engaged in a project like this how limited I really was in a lot of ways. So the drone program happened, and then for the last 9 years, a friend of mine who was working at St. John's Presbyterian for a while, Ty Singleton, he'd been a D1 softball coach and had this dream of an alternative athletics league. That he was very frustrated having been a D1 coach with athletic culture and what it's become in the United States, but didn't really know how to get that off the ground. Well, this unique window opened up in his life just before last summer where there was an opportunity to try and get that off the ground. And I already had enough things in play where I'm like, we could start one more. Ty could run this. And so I went to Ty and said, Ty, how much money do you need to start this program? And he said $55,000. I was like, ooh. And he wanted to start with a strength training program so you could train kids and their muscle groups properly so they wouldn't get injured as frequently with sports, and build character development and mentorship and life skills all into that. So we created Utmost Athletics. We brought it under the umbrella of the Forge's 501c3. And we handle all the bookkeeping and all the other grant writing and all the other stuff to help him get that off the ground. So in a lot of ways, we're like in a support position to help Ty. And 3 weeks into the program, there's already 50 students engaged in that warehouse out there doing this lifting program. It's amazing. And segments of kids we didn't expect. We have half the Clark College baseball team works out in there. We have a bunch of middle schoolers that are starting to come along. In fact, it's creating all sorts of ministry problems because now we're trying to figure out how do we fit this many kids into the mentor model. Not all of them probably want to be in the mentor model. What does that look like? We're troubleshooting left and right on this thing, but it's up and running and it's an amazing gospel opportunity. They're starting to do some shared meals together and other things. We're just starting to explore what this will really look like, but it dovetails in nicely with the Forge's overall program. So these are the 3 wings. Kids don't have to do any of these, or they could do all of them, or they could just be mentored and do the life skills. This is them flying their own drone that they bought after they did the program, so they bought this together so they could use it. We've talked about monetizing the drone program, but just haven't had the bandwidth to be able to do that or figure out how to do it yet, like taking photos and videos for real estate agents, things like that. There's 3 other ideas that are in the pipe that we'll probably never get to, but could. This was last year's class of students, and we'll get this year's class here in about another week. We'll have a sense of how big they're going to be and this is actually right after so when they do the goal setting training, they actually do that face-to-face and next to each other. It's actually my favorite training because you have a 65-year-old retired airline pilot setting goals for the next year of their life next to a 17-year-old who wants to be the first person in their family to go to college. They're coming from vastly different phases of life, but it's so cool for them to share that together. And when they sit down, part of their goal is to actually keep each other accountable for the goals that they've set. So you've got the 17-year-old checking in on the 65-year-old to see how they're doing on their goals as well. And when I was brought here, part of what I was brought here to do is try to help our church be more intergenerational. And we really struggled. We knew that we wanted mentoring, but we didn't know how to get out that without it being really awkward. And it's funny, you put something really practical in front of people, and all of a sudden the intergenerational part happens. And then I'm finding it's much easier actually to talk about faith in the context of real life than it is as a part of just a generalized discipleship program. And that part's been really, really cool. So these are some of those. This is the Last Supper we have at Pizza Place, where we share. And some really cool stuff came out. Last year, we had one kid who said I suspect that he might have been a little bit on the spectrum, because we have a lot of just fascinating social interactions sometimes, and it was difficult for his mentor to figure out how to do communication and things like that. And it was fascinating because just very bluntly and awkwardly into the room, he said, I've done a lot of tech programs through the schools. This is the first time anyone ever challenged me to treat the person offering the services as a human being. And that blew me away, because it was a really honest statement. It's a really big indictment of how our program-based teenage help goes on in most of our the relational transactions that happen for the teenage, what that actually looks and feels like. And it was also really a gospel moment, because I was like, for this kid to realize that there's a human being at the other end of this thing who also needs to be loved and isn't just there to give them something that they get to take for their own individual benefit is an important moment. And there was another kid down at the end of our table who said, this guy, Jerry, it's the first time that I've ever had an adult friend in my life. an adult that I can rely on. And that was profound to hear that uttered into a room of people that kid didn't necessarily know well. So that's our Last Supper. I had one more slide. I don't know what happened to it. My student and I this last weekend. What did I miss? What are the holes that you're not understanding? I do this in so many different contexts that I don't always know what I've missed anymore or what stories I've told. Questions that you have?
So I was a little late, but, so did you kind of just write the curriculum? Did you not, I like to bring a bunch of people?
Yes, I wrote most of the curriculum on my own, and then I used some of the expertise of also people on my team. What I really did was I built my team that I started with really intentionally. So initially, Laurel's here. I went to her husband, Fitz, our head of staff, and I said, Fitz, I got this crazy idea. I don't know if it's good yet or not, but I'd like to quietly form a team. Partially, I didn't want the church to know I was doing it because I was worried that if we turned it into a church program, no one would be interested in it. And I wanted people to find out about it by ear and then come and find me when they were interested enough to learn more, because I figured that would be a nice filter to figure out who really wanted to do the work and would be interested in it. So I formed initially a team, and I was really intentional about small business owners, people that were good at mentoring. I tend to be a macro picture and fly by the seat of my pants, adaptive kind of guy, and so I wanted to make sure I had logistical people that were on there that would be better at that and ask good organizational questions. That's how I built the team. Now we have a team and a board because we have a 501c3, right, nonprofit. Trying to figure out how to get them to interact is a whole new system problem that we have, right? There's all these growing components require different adaptive solutions. So, but it initially just started with a few, like one of those guys in the professional world had a lot of goal setting. So we did that, but then my job as pastor was to sit down and say, okay, this is great. Here's where this doesn't really jive with the gospel. So let's go ahead and look at goal setting through the lens of the gospel, because that's what I'm trained to do. Like that's what we're trained to do as ministers, is to help people theologically reflect on the way they're doing life. Likewise, we're supposed to theologically reflect, at least occasionally, on the way our models of ministry function. So that was kind of that exercise, which is a great exercise to have with somebody from your church, to say, well, here's where I want to challenge that a little bit, and let's tweak this kind of this way to say this, because here's what's going on with students, and here's what we're called to do. So it was a little bit of both. But ultimately, the buck has stopped with me, basically, to figure out what do we need in the binder, how do we go and find these people. Like, I knew we had these two marriage and family therapists, husband and wife, and I was like, I bet, I know a lot about Myers-Briggs, a bit about the Enneagram, and I'm like, I bet they know about a whole bunch more tools than I know about. So I went and recruited them and said, would you design training number 3? We can do it in relationship, but I need your expertise to help me reflect on whether what I've got actually works. And we continue to refine that one each year as we do it. Does that answer your question?
Totally.
Yeah.
So how did you find your first kid?
My first kid was actually the other youth worker at the church, Jim McLaughlin. His son, Ethan, was the one that I kind of recruited first. And then we had Brian Flores, who's now in the Army, and Brian's family just showed up at the church. His mom, Virginia, just lived close by, and they just showed up here and liked Columbia, and Brian had already kind of felt at home in the youth group, and I knew that they struggled to make ends meet. And so I kind of figured Brian might want a job, and then he mentioned that. He and his sister mentioned it at the tail end of one of our youth retreats, and I said, well, I might have a place I can employ you. Come work for Motown. And so we did. So it was really just sensing what kids might gravitate to it or what kids might need it, and then working on that. And then we started presenting in the schools. And that's been dramatic too. Like, every time I go into the schools, generally I'm the one who has to bring up faith. They don't. Like, they know I'm a minister, but because it's of such pragmatic value, they just don't care. They don't have time to care. I think most schools have realized that they drove a lot of churches and volunteer organizations out of their campuses, and they have a void of relationships. And so they're trying to figure out how to get good work done, and I think are discovering sometimes they've been their own worst enemy. And my mom was a public school teacher, my sister's a public school teacher, and my wife was a public school teacher. I understand pretty clearly about the boundaries, and I articulate pretty clearly for them where I'm coming from and what kind of program we are and what kind of church we are. And I also encourage them to reference check us with the middle school that we work with down the street and call the principal at MAC and say, have we been a bad customer on that campus in any particular way? And the answer is resoundingly no. And so they have no issues with us coming on and are very excited to have us come in. It's particularly when they find out we can offer mentors. That's the biggest difference, is we're not running a program where I'm leading a program of 65 kids in which I'm keeping a quota for federal funding. To put it bluntly, there's a lot of our programs that run off that model. And I'm not coming in trying to build the world's biggest, flashiest program. I'm about small batches of kids and as much individual relationship. Utmost out there, because the kids are in there 3 times a week for an hour and 15 minutes, we have allowed them to have a 1-to-5 ratio of mentorship, because they have so much more time than the kids would get with Motown. Because really the kids come out from Motown just on Saturdays to do projects. And then they're meeting with their mentor once a month for, say, 2 hours. So that really allowed us to triple down on relational time, the gym model. So the board kind of said, well, if we're doing it that way, given the volume of kids that are coming in the door, we could handle a 1-to-5 ratio, and we think that's workable. It feels relational, small groupish maybe, and that's handleable. Other questions? Yeah.
Are you running the Motown still as a profit?
No, it's now under the umbrella nonprofit, but it still generates revenue. It has never lost money. So I think last year we generated around $12,000 in net revenue on that. Year before, slightly higher. I don't know where we'll end up this year. So they all generate revenue, and that's part of my economic model. I do that because I think a lot of nonprofit work gets done inefficiently, and sometimes more slowly than it needs to be, because it doesn't have engagement with marketplace speed. And that I think is a helpful element if it's done healthily with the gospel behind it. And so for me, I'm also trying to build a model where potentially a smaller church with a youth worker they can afford to pay for 10 to 12 hours could maybe get to 20 to 30 and still be doing ministry if they have a social enterprise. Maybe they're majoring in 5 to 6 kids running a landscaping operation, right? I'm trying to test out those models to see what other churches could do if they want to run a similar model and fund their youth ministry slightly differently, if that makes sense. So, yeah. Other questions?
So how do you get the mentors involved?
Most of them are recruited through our church, but like when we expanded to the drone program, I went and tapped my HP engineers, and I said, do you know any people that would be interested in working with us that would be high-quality mentors? I won't take our model. We have a lot of abuse protocol stuff that's in place, like for abuse prevention, but our general model is we will only take somebody as a mentor if they are intimately known to our core group, like our core team or board, or if they are intimately known to one of those people. We will not go a ring beyond that, basically. Right now, all of our mentors but one are people of faith, and that matters to us. That matters to the ethos of what we're trying to do. But this other person was a really close friend of the other person. He knew she'd be a phenomenal mentor, and she has been probably our best female mentor, to be honest. At least with her student, her particular pairing has been amazing, and I'm so thankful for that. We don't know what that'll look like. I mean, theoretically, if we turned a corner all of a sudden and we had 100 students coming through the door, my next step would be expanding to other churches, which we're starting to do a little bit. But beyond that, it might be that I believe that God is at kingdom work well beyond the walls of the church, and believe God is working in the hearts of people well beyond the walls. And if this ministry is worth doing, and there are human beings capable of loving teenagers, I'm not close to that idea. It hasn't been a necessity, and my preference would be somebody that understands the theology behind what we're trying to do, the way we're trying to do it. But God may say there's actually a bigger harvest to be had here, and you don't get to put boundaries on that. I don't know. So, yeah. Maybe. It's happened before, somewhere in the Bible a few times, I think.
Matt, you talked early on about the concern for the students who are in the underprivileged socioeconomic categories.
Yeah.
When they would come, maybe you'd have them in the youth group for 2 years and then you'd see them go.
Yeah.
Could you trace that forward a little bit in terms of what you hoped would be a helpful model for lunch?
So like Brian, so I'll give you an example from like Brian. So Brian Flores came in. Brian is what I would call a grand slammer. For us, a base hit would be a kid that simply comes in the program, has a mentor for a year, gets some job skills, life skills. We've blessed our county. Wonderful. Brian was a part of youth group. I don't think we would have retained him. I think he felt the acute embarrassment. I sensed that dynamic coming with him. He continued to work for Motown. We got him that job down in Pacific Landscaping. He stayed on. We got him involved in the worship team because along the way we discovered he was actually really good at learning guitar by ear. Amazingly good at it. Got him integrated into the worship team. His mentor really chose to invest in him, Dave Patton, who goes to this church. Dave ended up showing up for worship probably 5 times as much as he did ordinarily because Bryant was up there helping in the worship team. And then we coached Bryant on his decision about going into the military. And that was really hard, actually, because my dad's a U.S. Marine. Dave graduated from the Air Force Academy. I love the military. At the same time, I know what it looks like to enlist. I lived across the river from Beale Air Force Base in Northern California, and I've tried to explain to many of our students, you've got to understand the kind of fellow students you're probably going to end up in the military with, and you may not like all of them, and you're probably going to be stuck repairing vehicles in a vehicle depot. Just buckle up, because whatever they told you, it's probably not true. And so we had those honest conversations and pushed on Brian a little bit. Brian pushed back. We said, all right, now it's time to just bless this kid. Brian knows what he wants to do. We're going to pray for him. We're going to celebrate him. And we did that. And Ryan reaches out probably 3 times a month to his mentor. He asks this church for prayer regularly. He's involved with the chaplain there at his Army base. I mean, it's phenomenal to see the work that's been done in his life through this. But people ask me, like, is this a parachurch ministry? Do you want it to? And my answer is absolutely not. Because I think it's the constellation of all of those things together. The real world, the on-the-ground trainings, the things that the church does sacramentally and otherwise, and just community-wise, when all of that comes together, and it doesn't come together for all of us or for all of our students the way that we want it to, because we don't control that, it's amazing what you see happen in somebody's life. Dylan Galicia, right, who's my particular student. I was going to show you the deal last Sunday. We went to the Vancouver Fire Department, and another congregant, Sam Harrison, who's a firefighter, gave us an hour-and-a-half tour, but Sam got to speak more than just like the technical skills of what he does as a firefighter. He got to talk about how meaningful that job is to him and how it's been meaningful to his family. He's delivered 2 babies. Like he's just talking to Dylan about what's been transformative about that job and calling. Dylan is now in worship pretty much every other Sunday, and he had never been to worship before that. He's helping to lead our middle school youth group as a high school student that helps out with the middle schoolers. Like he is integrated into the Christian life in its fullness in a way that he absolutely, I don't believe he ever would have been had he not been here. He's worked for Motown. He's now doing the strength training thing and paying his own way. We have a sliding scale fee that we charge for Utmost. And Dylan pays $25 a month out of money he earns from Motown. So he walks into that gym with his head held high because he knows he earned what he has in there, and he works harder for it because it pays for it. Those dynamics to me, when I think about marketplace, those exchanges can produce a kind of equality that matters if they're done right. And I see that with Dylan. Even some of our Motown clients, the adults that we serve. There's a woman about 2 miles east of here who has a social anxiety disorder, and her yard is just an absolute jungle because she can't really go outside of her house. And we were invited by a congregant to come and take care of her house, and we did. The neighborhood had tried to do it, and she got embarrassed, frustrated, and then angry, right? Because it's humiliating. They tried to have neighborhood kids come and do it, but they were sporadic. They didn't do a good job. Motown came in. We charged a lower rate than we ordinarily would. We do her lawn care a little bit less frequently, right? But it's not a jungle any longer, and she's as happy as she can be because she feels like she gets to pay for that exchange. Our kids get to work hard while they're there. We're doing good in the community, and we're not having to go out and get tons of grants for it because it partially pays for itself. So that's kind of how the model fits together, both on like a student level and an adult level. But those are the kind of kids that I would say. Brian's younger sister, Ashley, who was absolutely depressed, would just sit in her room. We couldn't get her to come to youth group, couldn't get her to do anything else. We paired her with our non-faith-based mentor, Megan, who does like horse work with horses and makes jewelry. And it has been amazing to see. Ashley's in worship more frequently. She is absolutely bonded with Megan. Megan is helping her figure out how she's going to go. She wants to do like salon work and is helping her figure out how she's going to do that. And Ashley's even now showed up to youth group a few times this year where she would not have before. She thought everybody was phony here, even though I think that everyone was not phony. Everyone was trying to care for her, and she didn't know how to receive that, their friendship, because she didn't feel like she was worthwhile for that friendship. So all of that has changed. She got involved in a drama production at her school, which is even further kind of brought her outward, having to do that kind of stuff. So those are the kids that I'm like, we long ago would have lost them. Young adults that we have that have been our crew bosses. This has created extra runway to do life development with them as we teach them how to lead a landscaping operation, right? I've taught 3 young adults how to back up with a trailer on a pickup truck. The fender on my pickup truck is crushed because of this, okay? I've lost multiple taillights, right? But part of that is coaching them through a situation in which you tell them, this is scary. You're going to have about 20 of these scary experiences over the next 10 years of your life until you figure out where you're going to be as an adult. So get used to this feeling. Let's work past it and learn how to do this new skill, because this is what you're going to have to do over the next 10 years. And I wouldn't have had that runway, that relational runway with them if we hadn't had these things built. I can see all over the place the ways that we've extended relational capacity because of this model. And given what we see about like adolescent development and how it's lengthening, like the period of adolescence, that's exactly what we need. And it's totally unaffordable unless we can find a different economic model to lengthen that runway, because we couldn't hire enough staff to do that, right? So that's been really, really cool. I literally got a thank you from one of our crew bosses, Amy, who has tended to your house, right? Amy sent me a photo of her with, I forget what the trailer's called, but it's one of the really long horse trailers down in Eugene, because she's now working at equine therapy operation. And she sent me a picture of her in the driver's seat of the truck with that massive trailer on the back. And she said, I just want you to know, I think about Motown and all that you guys have invested in me every single day I back up this trailer. I'm super thankful. And part of that coaching for her as a young adult was also to help her take a risk and actually going down and even interviewing for that job. She's a UW grad. Like, she graduated from UW, but just got stuck in figuring out what the plan was going to be for the next thing. And it was like, hey, you have got to figure out how to get over this fear and go take a shot. And she got down there and she was like, this is amazing. I totally want to work here. And now she's doing it. So it's all of those. So people ask how many, like, what's our goal socioeconomically? Like, what kind of kid do we want? I want every kind of kid. Because I want kids in our program cross-pollinating across socioeconomic levels. And I actually think that some of our high socioeconomic kids are more needy in certain areas of their life than our kids that are lower in terms of lower socioeconomics. Every one of my low-income kids can navigate the bus system in Clark County. If I tried to get one of my high-income kids from one side of the county to the other by bus, some of them would be in tears. I kid you not. They would probably cry. Because those low-income kids have had to figure it out some ways that our higher-income kids have. So I really want every kind of kid in my program. I think we all learn something from that. Anyway, other questions? I don't even know where we are time-wise or what my time frame is. But okay.
Yeah, till 2:30.
Oh, right. Well, we'll go out and look at the warehouse in a minute. Any other questions, like theological, about the model, about what, like why do I care about social enterprise in general, financial sustainability, any of that? I didn't know.
I'd love to ask you, a little bit more theologically. So one of the challenges I have, I'm a youth director and I have my own kids, is when I have them in certain programs, they're constantly being pushed to be the best or to be better than somebody else. And immediately, as I heard you talking, I thought, because I'm so tired of my kids being pushed to try to climb over other children.
Right.
And so tell me what you're doing to help kids resist what the world says about what their future depends upon.
Right.
It doesn't depend on climbing on somebody else.
Right. Well, in one way, if you look at the fours, in some ways it plays into that, right?
Okay.
Because it's doing practical trainings that help move you ahead in life, which just speaks into that narrative instead of against it. But we do try, but part of that is because that allows us to do the outreach, because that's what they want, sadly, exclusively, that's what they want sometimes. So we try, like I said, when we build our trainings, we try to violate, when we talk about goal setting, we want to be disruptive in the same way that Jesus would tell a story to be disruptive, to actually reveal the nakedness of the narrative by which you operate your life. And so we try to bring in Christian teachings to say, well, we're not really interested in measuring that here because we actually think that's a dead end for you. But youth group itself, when
measuring what?
like the idea that they're not a whole person if they're not setting goals for themselves.
Oh, right.
Or if they don't have money, or they can't manage money. Like, one of the questions we ask in the money management training is we bring them in and say, if I gave you $1 million, what would you spend it on? And I found that most people can answer that question in about a minute and a half. They've got a pretty darn good idea. We then flip that later in the training and make it uncomfortable then and say, if I gave you $1 million right now, what would you do to transform your world? And it is fascinating how hard it is for teenagers and adults to answer that question. And we talk about, isn't it embarrassing that we have spent so much time thinking about the one question and not the other? And I think that's the kind of thing that the gospel does. It pulls us into spaces we know, and then it says, and then it just flips that on its head and points out how just ridiculous that is.
So instead of focusing on that student, you
talk about like why the church matters. For me, this space in here is the space where that message is at its fullness, where we really affirm that they are a beloved child of God, apart from anything that they do. They are deeply loved, and that nobody and no failure can take that away. And
when you say the space, you mean in youth ministry?
yeah, in youth ministry, and then our mentors can bring that about if they feel it's appropriate with a student.
Okay.
But those spaces work together. So the reason I built this, and part of the way is I felt, we baptized 2 kids from Battleground in our church 4 years ago. And I was running them home one night, dropping them off. And I'm dropping one kid off to a trailer that has no running water. And I'm dropping another kid off to a trailer, or to his grandma's house. The reason he's at grandma's house is that his mom's, he is the product of he and his mom's drug counselor getting together. Okay? Then he moved in with grandma and grandpa. When he moved in with grandma and grandpa won a whopping $20,000 in the lottery and ran off with his girlfriend. So this kid has been abandoned twice in his life, and his dad's his mom's drug counselor. And I'm driving away from that house, and I'm thinking about how excited the church was that we baptized these 2 kids, rightfully so, in some ways. And James 2:16 comes into my head, which is, if I tell you to go in peace, and eat your fill, but I don't put, and I'll put clothing on your back and food in your stomach, what good have I done? And I was struck that my youth ministry model, the space in here, as beautiful as it is, did nothing to answer the question, what have we done for that kid if grandma has a stroke? What have we done for that kid 2 years from now when it's going to be just as easy to sit on the couch playing Xbox, talking about getting a job, but he's really scared of how to do that? We haven't tended to any of that part of his life. And to me, that's like we just decided arbitrarily that we didn't need to do anything about that half of the gospel. And so I was bothered by that. And so that's part of what we tried to do in here, is to say, I've got to care for that part of kind of that kid's life, essentially. I don't even know if I answered the question, if I can remember what the question was. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions? Okay. Great. Anyone interested in starting one of these things?
With a lot of help, maybe.
Yeah. It is daunting. I had to laugh out loud. I went to a thing at Princeton Seminary where I graduated from. They have this incubators thing they run where you can actually go and incubate your ideas for this. It's pretty cool. And one of the presenters said that you just need to chip away at this about 15 minutes at a time each day. And I almost laughed out loud because I was like, there is no way that you can get this kind of thing off the ground unless you have a team of people and everybody is committed to banging away on this thing and trying to say, and they're willing to risk their time, their love, their talent, and even their treasure on doing something like this. And part of the reason I think it's not possible to do it without that is, well, obviously it won't get off the ground, but I also think that people will not be drawn to it until people are taking a risk. I think part of what has created the appeal of this model and caused people to come and volunteer is their sense that I took a big risk. And because of that, I think it's other people have said that I'm fascinated by that, or I want to be a part of that, or how can I vicariously take a risk with you through that. And so I think that changes the dynamic. And so I think it's very possible. One of the things that I was saying that's changed in my mind is when I started this, I was very concerned that we wouldn't have money to sustain it. And that's still a concern, but I actually think that we have an unbelievable abundance of resources at our disposal that we haven't even realized are out there. I think money is the last possible problem on the list, actually, in this model. In fact, let me show you a thing from my other presentation that I share sometimes that's helpful. So I developed this thing called the 4 Rings of Social Enterprise, like Christian social enterprise, which is, I think, for basically 1,700 years, the church has been functioning in this center ring, sort of the Christendom ring, of funding our ministries, funding the kingdom work that we really want to do, right? And largely what that inner ring, that Christendom economy relies upon is what I would call cultural subsidization. We rely on people, and it's amazing to me how people still do this. Sometimes I'm flabbergasted that people still show up for church and they still give money the way that they do. The church that I grew up in Southern California, right on the coast, is isolated. It's never had a passionate bone in its body. Periodically I check online to see if it's still there, and it is, to my utter amazement sometimes. time, still functioning. And I'm amazed sometimes at the generosity of people and their sense of love for this place and all this stuff, right? It blows my mind. But we've lived on that ring almost exclusively, and it's disappearing. Like, sometimes somewhat rapidly, sometimes inch by inch. And that's what we funded ourselves on. And as it's disappearing, you can feel in churches and in ministry conversations that panic button is going up a little bit. That sense of how do we, well, one, some people's like, how will I keep a roof over my head? For other people, it's a question of how will we do the kingdom work that we want to do? So outside of that kind of ring of like Christendom economy, I think there's a passion economy. And the passion economy for me is that the average American gives, 2.5% of their income to charitable work. And I hear pastors gripe about that all the time. And I tell you that my internal reaction to that is that's not their fault, that's your fault. You have the single most compelling story in the history of the world, and you can't figure out how to tell it in such a way that people would be willing to lay down more of their treasure and their time for it. Or we can't build ministry models that would draw people into the extent that they would want to lay their lives down for them. That's our fault. That's not their fault. And I think we haven't built vehicles that actually enable people to say, I could be a part of that. There's a guy in our gym space, you'll see in a little bit. He's not going to be in there. The gym space will be there. There's a guy who came in, he's never volunteered for ministry at our church in any capacity. He walked into that gym space for 15 seconds and I could do this. I could do ministry this way, through this vehicle. I think we've designed a lot of really generic vehicles, like serving at the food bank, backpack drives, like these things that don't actually allow the adults in our churches who've often worked for like 30 years at building very specific gifts and skill sets. They don't give them a way to utilize those gifts. And so the ministry that we offer them feels disinterested, it feels like uninteresting, it feels very sporadic, and it doesn't feel like it taps into like what they've worked on developing. So like it doesn't tap into their passions, right? And there's two levels of passion. There's interest and skill set, but the word passion itself really means to suffer for something. So we haven't built ministries that actually invite them into a space where there's something so worthwhile they'd be like, I would give my blood, sweat, and tears to do that. And until we start building those vehicles, we shouldn't be surprised that that other, 7.5% of their income doesn't come our way in terms of a tithe number, whatever. And so there's a passion economy that we could tap into that I don't think we've begun to tap into. Beyond that is kind of the nonprofit economy, which is I don't think churches have been very good at looking for grants. They haven't been very good at tapping into local foundations, right? All of those kind of places. The church has been oblivious because it hasn't had to. It's been in this sort of contented center ring where people give money and they show up consistently and they feel an obligation or they feel a passion for the church, right? And outside of that nonprofit economy is the wallet economy, which is every day in our world there are trillions of dollars of transactions that take place, and we have never figured out a way to combine ministry with those transactions very effectively. We used to, in the first 3 centuries, like monasteries in particular, were really good at creating economic engines around the monastery to help it sustain itself, and they knew how to tap into the overall economy. So it's like, yeah, somebody can go buy a cup of coffee at, Starbucks number 59613 down the road, or they could be buying it on your church property and having a conversation about life, or knowing that part of that cup of coffee, a significant part of it, might actually go to do fair trade work or something like that. I mean, there's loads of ways this model can express itself. I just read about, or saw a video yesterday about a guy in Israel who's a Jew, and he's created an interfaith model of ministry where the biggest problem there is that they can't get ambulances fast enough to sites. And so he created a volunteer-based kind of Uber network, which puts basic medical equipment on the back of motorcycles that can shoot between traffic, and they've got the response time down to 3 minutes, and those 911 calls are down to 3-second response time before a volunteer picks up. Those volunteers ride around the city on motorcycles with this built-in medical pack. They've all been given first aid training, and their agreement in a very difficult setting in Jerusalem is they will care for people regardless of faith. They don't care. It's amazing. And that is a business. He runs that with profit margins. It's actually, that one is a nonprofit, but it is self-sustaining at this point. So there's loads of ways you can kind of tap into this. There's a guy just north of here who was giving 20% of his net income from an engineering consulting business to his church missions. Somebody in my church put me on to him. He went on a church mission trip to Rwanda, and was there and noticed that all the motorcycles that he saw that were kind of beat up around the roads were all made by one factory in India. So he bought a plane ticket, got on a plane, flew to India, found where the factory was, somehow got inside and figured out how, I think just kind of talked with people and got inside, looked at how the motorcycles are made. He said, we can make these better, lower cost in Rwanda by Rwandans. And created the Rwandan Motorcycle Company, which is making thousands of motorcycles now across Rwanda, including a new unit they're trying to capitalize for, which is this teeny little motorcycle that will take the poorest people's economic radius from 5 miles of work commute to being able to commute 20 miles, which means they could get jobs in other towns in a way that they couldn't before. And he does that on a for-profit basis. And it's amazing. And everybody at that factory knows that they earned every dollar that they've got. They can walk in with their heads held high because they're producing a good product that benefits their country. It's amazing. So that economy out there where people are making general transactions can be tapped into, and that's what like Motown does. You want to get your lawn mowed for $50, or you want to get it mowed for $50 and have that directed back into the community. It's a value proposition.
So, question for you. So last week I met with the administrations at Heritage, Prairie, and Evergreen schools, and we're just talking to them about their families and their students and what were one of their greatest needs. And they said that their low-income students, especially those who are in transitional housing, i.e. homeless, they need resources to be able to get housing. Because right now, they're a completely left out demographic.
Yep.
So, how would you say, how could something like the social enterprise help students that are in that situation then be able to be self-sustaining when they graduate from high school? So they may not have family or anyone that's a support network to text them.
I don't know. So social enterprise is a pretty broad circle, right? So it's
Doesn't Columbia
in
doesn't
crisis.
you guys have a house?
Well, we have a house, and that's young adults right there. And there's been conversation on our session about how we would do housing once we get out this last leg of our capital campaign. There's discussion about could people buy other homes in the neighborhood that we could use for low-income housing. We've absolutely talked about it. We even bought that parcel because we thought we might be able to develop tiny homes on the right side. Turns out we can't because of certain covenants that they have in the neighborhood. We're open to that. We paused, both because of the capital phase that we were in, but also because it creates lots of ministry questions that have to be answered. Like, number one, how do we choose between a family that's low income in our church versus an exterior family? And what are the dynamics that will create if we make that choice? What do we do with a low-income family if we do it on a rental basis so that it's not completely free, or do we want to do it purely for homeless? How do we staff the resources if we're not charged? If there's no rent, how do we staff the human resources for somebody that's got enough expertise to actually work with those families? And the high trauma situations that go along with it. All of those caused the session to kind of say, okay, there's a lot of questions. Let's stop until we're ready to make this move, and then let's come back to this conversation when we feel like we actually have the bandwidth and capital to want to engage it. I'm very interested in that question. It's part of the reason that I convinced the church not to sell its manse and do young adult housing, was that down the road, internally, I hope that if we had 2 young adult houses, we might start to have to engage the other housing problems that are there in our community. So I don't know. My sense is that the social enterprise way that I talk about it is harder to do when you have folks that are in heavy and major crisis situations. So I talk a lot about equal exchange, and that matters, but when folks are in true crisis situations, I don't have a problem with no strings attached help. I don't have a problem with that at all. It's hard, that's a harder model to sustain. I've been focused on trying to create models that are sustainable but are making good impact because I haven't had any bandwidth to do that. I got no problem with somebody going out and getting $1 million worth of annual donors and using that for homeless housing. I think there might be ways that kids that are a part of a homeless program, I would love to have come and figure out how to work with us, or perhaps a place that's doing that to build their own little economic model that could employ some of the students or family members or things like that. People have asked us about house cleaning businesses. I'd love to do that. I just can't do it with teenagers because they can't use some of the chemicals and things you would need to do that job effectively, probably by most people's standards. They can't do that. There's loads of ways you can do this. It's just a question of, do you have the people that have the bandwidth and passion to engage it and enough capital to get it started, and can you put up with the risk? But specifically in that one, it might be harder to build it the same way I built this one, just because you're dealing with high transients and probably higher levels of trauma.
You would need an on-site like caseworker.
Totally. Like Jim McLaughlin, so he works one-on-one with our young adults, and quite a number of our young adults in the first 2 iterations of this, I mean, they needed like daily coaching on the most basic things. It was insane. It was absolutely insane. Like, I'll give you a funny example. Like, he got called in at 11 o'clock at night because the sink was clogged, and they didn't know what to do. And he got over there, and you know what he did? He lifted the sink trap. Like, they had exercised so little initiative. They were so paralyzed by the fact that the sink was clogged and full of water. They hadn't even bothered to lift the sink trap to try and unclog it themselves. Like, we've run into all sorts of administrative dynamics where we were like, holy cow. There are a ton of young adults in our community who have not been coached by parents in the most basic functions of how to navigate day-to-day life. And some of the kids in that house are coming from very high-performance, high-achieving families. It was remarkable. Sheltered, or not even necessarily sheltered, sometimes just neglected in a different way. They have not been neglected materially. They have been neglected in terms of humanity and parenting. So it's been amazing to see what we've run into in some of these different models. So yeah, so Jim has to function as kind of a coach really in that environment. I think you definitely need that from somebody who'd probably be willing to get some, or augment some training along the way to make that model work. Or it's possible that a more baseline economic model of one of these might create a revenue stream to allow that less sustainable model to run. That's another way of doing it or looking at it.
What age do you have in your house?
18 up. There's been nobody that's been under 18 in that one. A lot of them are up to like 24, 25 even, 26. They're just stuck sometimes. Some of them have lots of debt.
Modern brain science says there's still kids until they're
Yes.
mid-20s anyways.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
But legally, there's a lot of difference between
Sure.
the 18 and the 14 or 15-year-old.
Oh yeah. No, I'm just saying.
Maybe final question, we'll go check out the wait space.
What other enterprises did you do with teenagers?
So I had a guy from the Covenant Church reach out to me from Northern California like 2 years ago with an entire business plan he offered to me on a videography business for students. I just needed $40,000 in capital to get it off the ground, and I didn't have that. But he'd tell me all the equipment I need to buy, basically going and videotaping all the sports leagues and having families pay for footage of their kids playing sports. Sports is a $17 billion industry annually. And the kids would go out and film those games on Saturdays at all the sports leagues. That's in our hopper. We're starting to look at like how we might be able to pull that off now that our revenue stream is better. But I just couldn't take advantage of it. The cleaning business I thought about. There's another one I forget right now. The public schools. So what? Yeah, the public schools. So
Heritage, which is one of our lower income schools here, high school, have a full-on florist shop in their school. It was amazing going in there. I mean, you felt like you were in a florist shop with the glass refrigerators and the students. I mean, and you can purchase their floral arrangements.
Yeah. The local schools also, so Chris, you brought that up from the other high schools, one of which I did call, by the way. Columbian had on the front page, was it a 5, it was either 4 out of 5 or 5 out of 6 Washington State voters think that the single biggest hole in public education is that it does not actually get their kids ready for employable work in real life. That was the #1 concern. And I sensed that concern was developing in our students a number of years ago and in our parents. And I'm like, yep, that's it, absolutely. And that's exactly what we're trying to get at. It's partially, it is an outreach hook. It's because it's where they are. If I'm a missionary coming to the United States and I'm trying to figure out how do I build Christian community, and I have to recognize, in my opinion, that money is highly valued, sometimes to our utter shame. Time is extremely precious, and you better be willing to interact with the marketplace because this is a marketplace-driven country. And if you can't engage those in some way, I think people will have trouble figuring out how to initiate a relationship with initial gospel questions in some ways. I think you'd want to build a model with some of those elements in it if you were coming fresh into this. And right now, it is a very acute concern of teenagers and families. The public schools, one of the things, because like Washington State, our funding laws have just changed related to education, Many schools are scrambling and struggling to figure out now how they're going to fund the programs that they've had until they can get all the funding sorted out. If I could walk into the public schools tomorrow, if I had like $150,000 in funding for like the next 2 years, I would walk into our public schools tomorrow and I would offer to put on a philanthropic Shark Tank countywide with school-based teams. I would bring in business people to sit and judge those competitions, and we would give them $7,000 each to win that contest, and then they'd have to go launch that philanthropic venture, perhaps on their own campus. I would do that in a heartbeat. I would walk in and offer other mentoring trainings that we do to any public school that wanted it. I just don't have the bandwidth and capacity to pull off, and they would go for it because they need it. They know they need it, and their staff is so unbelievably spread thin. It's amazing to walk into like a public school meeting and hear the giant shotgun pattern of what they're expected to cover now in terms of human development, education, anxiety, depression, mental health. Like it's nuts. It's nuts that we're asking our public schools to do all of this work, and many times it's teachers who are getting pulled 4 different directions to pull that off. And they will tell you when you go in, they say, well, we're really reluctant to open the programs because we'll get $100,000 in funding, but we won't be able to sustain it, and we don't want to start a program that's going to expire after 2 years. And we've watched that happen in our middle school down here, where they'll get a grant for technology, or they'll get a grant for a staff member, or they'll get a grant for this, and the grant runs out and it disappears. And that's the exact opposite of what low-income students need. They need longevity of relationship. What I'm trying to pitch to the school is the idea that if an outside entity can come up with $25,000, and instead of the school having to come up with 50 to 60, which is probably what it takes for them to get an employee in-house, given all of the strictures that they have in the system they're a part of, and that nonprofit could provide the other $25,000, now you've arrived at one position that allows you to do your goal of, say, mentoring or job training in a way that's sustainable, because that outside entity is incentivized to get the grants and private funding to sustain the position, whereas the teacher really is not and doesn't have the time to do it. And that, I think there's massive opportunity in our local schools to do quality ministry work and bless our communities if we can figure out how to do it.
Were you going to say something about some of your employment partners? Don't you have a couple?
There are a few, like Par Lumber has hired some of our students, and they have amazing benefits and full-time work. The nursery that's right over here keeps a stack of our Motown brochures and cards on their counter to hand to customers to bring us business. It's amazing to walk through the door of a local business when you have this kind of idea, and they are so excited about it. I'm trying to think what other partners. Park Rose Hardware helps support us with some equipment repair, and they'll give us equipment at cost. Steel Northwest, which makes chainsaws, weed whackers, all that stuff. They just gave us another round, a second round of all their training equipment that they train their employees on, who go out and demo it for stores. So we got the demo equipment to use for Motown, and all that obviously affects our overhead. We're partnered with PIC, which is Partners in Careers, which is a countywide program that takes low-income students and will pay for their first 90 hours of employment. So PIC will actually, if Motown were to hire a kid, PIC would pay as an internship for the 90 hours we probably need to train them properly. Likewise, we could take a kid from just the General Forge program, and we could say, let's walk through the door of Papa Murphy's together with your certificate, your mentor, and now 90 hours that's free to them, and see if they're interested in employing you instead of the other student. So there's lots of missional partnerships that have sprung up out of this in unexpected ways.
So just reflecting on being the son of a small business owner.
Yes.
And being, recognizing the market analysis that there are less jobs available, the number of people that are trying to seek jobs, not just for young people, but for all.
Yes.
I would love to engage around the idea of small business mentorship. How do you get kids and young adults thinking about starting or helping them start their own? Because I think there needs to be more than just
we had actually flirted with that. We flirted with that this year. There's a small barbecue sauce company called American Soul Brothers, which runs around here, and it's kind of a long story, but we were going to partner with them so they could bring kids to do food displays like Chuck's and Fred Meyer and other places. Fred Meyer, right? Yeah. And sometimes I screwed up with Wegmans in New Jersey. They had been, it's really frustrating actually on kind of like a racial reconciliation model, I don't know how else to say it. They had been essentially promised by a local foundation some money, And I don't think the person that promised them the money had actually done their due diligence, checking with who actually held the purse strings. And so I walked through the door trying to facilitate a relationship so that they could coach on entrepreneurship, and we could help them by providing them with our mentor trainings and other stuff, and then the rug got pulled out from under all of that because somebody hadn't done their homework. I'm still pretty pissed about that, to be honest, because I felt like I was trying to do good racial reconciliation work, and I felt like I got completely hosed by our local foundation, and I'm still pretty ticked about it, actually, so it's pretty embarrassing. But the goal was to get our kid, those two guys specifically wanted to coach kids on mentorship, or on entrepreneurship, which I was really excited about. And if I had the money, I would love to fund them to do that, and absolutely we want to coach them how to do that. But again, it's just all capacity.
We need to talk about that.
Okay.
I have 2 members of my church who are connected with American Soul Brothers.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
We should talk about that then. Absolutely. Okay, great. Want to go see the workout space really quick?
Let's do it.
Okay, great.